In the 1980s, Hironobu Sakaguchi had wanted to make a role-playing game for the Nintendo Famicom, but the company he worked at, Square, refused to give him permission. This was until the release of Dragon Quest in 1986 and its subsequent success. Because of the massive success of the game, Square would give Sakaguchi the go-ahead, and he, along with a small team, would begin the production of what would end up becoming Final Fantasy. Fast forward 37 years, after 19 mainline games, over 100 spin-offs, countless film adaptations, and billions of dollars of revenue, the franchise is now in a very interesting situation. The last couple mainline Final Fantasy games have been received badly, to say the least, and the best-selling game they've had in recent years is a remake of a game they made in 1997. Final Fantasy XVI, their most recent release, received mixed reviews, with a lot of people pointing out its very large flaws. It's to the point where the term modern Final Fantasy game has negative connotations due to the large dislike of the modern titles. But how did we get here? How did we go from an industry titan that defined the genre and changed the industry with every new release to what a lot of people are describing as mediocre and uninspired? I'm going to dive into some of the modern Final Fantasy games, go over some of the most common dislikes and arguments against these games, and give my opinion as to whether Final Fantasy really is dying or not. So if that's something you think you're interested in, then stick around, because in this video we'll be diving into the downfall of Final Fantasy. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Trying to hit 1,000 subscribers before 2025. So a lot of people think that Final Fantasy XIII was the beginning of this modern era of mediocre Final Fantasy games, and for the most part I do agree and I will go into that, but I feel like the first Final Fantasy game to get major backlash was Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII was an interesting game, with it featuring a lot of unique ideas in its design and it being a radical departure from 10. But the most unique part of the game, and the part that causes the most contention when covering the game, is its combat. Final Fantasy XII is the first mainline game to take a completely different approach to combat. The game features a new combat system which mixes turn-based with real-time combat. Additionally, there's a gambit system where you don't actually control your allies and they're essentially just automated. Many people didn't and still don't like this combat system, and I feel like this is important to bring up because people disliking a new combat system is a pattern you'll begin to notice in this video. 3 years after 12 was released, Final Fantasy XIII came out, and if you thought people disliked 12, well, just wait till you hear about 13. Final Fantasy XIII is probably the most hated and disliked Final Fantasy game, with it often being regarded as the worst and most disappointing game in the franchise. And the fact that there's 3 of them just kind of adds insult to injury. There's a lot of reasons to hate 13, so much that I might make a video about it one day, but to dilute it into 3 main points, I'd say the main reasons would be the story and the game's linearity. To be honest, I kinda liked 13's story. I liked the characters and I found the world of 13 very interesting, but it's definitely the weakest of all the Final Fantasy games I've played. A lot of people feel that the story was convoluted and confusing and that the game introduces too many concepts early in the game and expects you to remember them all. People also dislike the characters as the development throughout the game is very formulaic, and outside of the playable characters, a lot of them were just kind of useless and forgettable. As for the linearity, it's pretty self-explanatory. The world design in 13 is very linear, which itself isn't a bad thing. Matter of fact, I'd even argue that games like 7 and 10 are also pretty linear. But the difference between those games and 10 is that even though they have linear worlds and areas, those places are still interesting and filled with intriguing shit. 13's world is just kind of empty. It feels like it's missing something. The lack of NPCs and side quests really hindered my enjoyment of the game, not to mention the linearity of the game's leveling and combat. Apart from these 2 main points, there are other aspects of this game that I and many other people dislike, like some of the stupid systems and design choices in the game. Final Fantasy XIII was the beginning of what I consider modern Final Fantasy. The game failed to meet the fans' expectations, and while I don't hate the game, I wouldn't say that I like it either. Final Fantasy XV, however, is a completely different story. I love this game, and I'd say it's probably one of my favorite games of all time. But regardless, I'll try my best to be unbiased when talking about it. Coming out 7 years after 13, Final Fantasy XV is similar to 12 in that it's the first mainline game in the series to have real-time combat. In my opinion, it's the first game in the series to have a real fleshed out open world. Also, fun fact, 15 was originally going to be a spin-off of 13. Thank God that didn't happen. I feel like the reasons behind 15's hate are very different to the reasons behind 13's hate. 15 is hated because it's different. It tried to do a lot of new things, which is something I love about the game, but it's also why a lot of people dislike the game. But in my opinion, the biggest reason for the game's hate is that on release, it really wasn't what it should have been, with a lot of changes and things being added in with multiple DLCs and patches. So I'm just gonna dive into this. First off is the new real-time action combat system. When I first played the game, I loved the combat, but in hindsight and after replaying some of the game, I can admit that it's not the greatest. I feel like it's solid for what it is, but the shitty development cycle really shows in the combat. The combat can feel very boring with there essentially only being one attack button with a short combo for each weapon. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of weapons in this game, but it doesn't stop the combat from getting repetitive and boring very quickly. The additional DLCs added the ability to play as one of the guys during combat, which made the combat way more enjoyable, but this wasn't available in the original release of the game, so yeah. Also, the upgrade system in this game seems kinda useless. Like, there are some upgrades that you can get that like improve quality of life, but it's just very lacking when compared to other Final Fantasy games. Second is the open world. While the open world is beautiful, it can also feel very empty. Your main means of transportation is a car that auto drives through long unchanging roads, and while I personally kind of enjoyed the car drives just listening to music and chilling, I can understand why other people didn't. And once again, with the release of additional DLCs, this problem got absolutely fucking destroyed because they added a flying car which made transportation a lot more fun. But this also wasn't around at release. So yeah. Even though I personally was fine with the amount of content in the world, a lot of people felt that there wasn't enough side quests and side activities, or that the side activities there aren't good enough. Like, I'm sorry, but I really disagree with this point. But yet again, a lot of things were added with patches in the Royal Edition that made the game feel a lot more complete, and I didn't play 15 at release, so I can't really speak on this. Lastly is the story and the characters, which is something I agree and disagree with. I actually really enjoyed 15's story, like more than I thought I would, but I actually do agree with some of the complaints. One of them is the fact that the anime and movie contains a lot of information that should have just been in the game, and I feel like this point is over-exaggerated, but it is still valid. Also, the romantic element of the game with Luna and Noctis is severely underdeveloped, and the main plot of the game is also underdeveloped. The best part of this game's story for me was the relationship between the four main characters, with a lot of my favorite moments from this game being interactions with them. But unfortunately, I feel like the game slacks everywhere else when it comes to the story. The game's development cycle left the game in a very bare-bones state at release. That stacked on top of all the changes the game introduced made for a really bad reception. However, this game is nothing like 13. Final Fantasy 15 truly is a good game, just make sure that you play the Royal Edition. And now we have the most recent mainline game of the franchise. Released in June of last year, Final Fantasy 16 is yet another game that made some drastic changes to the Final Fantasy formula and received a mixed reception because of it. But I feel like it's important to note that 16's reception is nowhere near as bad as 13's or 15's. One thing I noticed is that for a lot of people, the release of 16 just came and went, with it not receiving nearly as much attention as a mainline Final Fantasy release should get. The main thing that people say about this game is that it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game, and I completely understand where they're coming from. This is probably the game I have the least to say about, which is quite indicative of the game as a whole. The combat in 16 took a way more character action-oriented approach with some staff from the Devil May Cry team working on the game, and you can definitely see the Devil May Cry influence in the game's combat. Its combat is way better than 15, and in general it is very enjoyable, but it can also feel very mediocre and shallow. It can also feel a bit clunky at times, with the camera also being an occasional nuisance. And it also feels very easy a lot of the time, which is a massive downside for me as the combat feels lacking in depth and difficulty. Apart from the combat, the game is just very basic and lacking in detail. I feel like the game is undercooked. Like I asked for a medium rare steak, but instead they gave me like some undercooked chicken that's still pink inside, if you get what I'm saying. The camaraderie and relationship between the main characters was nice and almost reminiscent of 15, but I still didn't really care for the story. It has many exciting build-ups, but the payoffs just felt weak. Overall, the game just feels very unpolished. There's a comment on Reddit that does a pretty good job of describing my thoughts on this game. It's a worse Devil May Cry than Devil May Cry and a worse Final Fantasy than Final Fantasy. This is because it tries to be both and ends up being mediocre at both instead of excelling in one or the other. I'm just gonna be honest. I'd be lying if I didn't say there was a clear difference in quality between the last couple of Final Fantasy games and some of the earlier games, but I feel like the difference is being overstated. The 7 remake showed us that Square Enix still has what it takes to create good games, now we just need them to put that same time and effort into a mainline game as opposed to a reboot. Final Fantasy isn't dying, it hasn't fallen off, it's not cooked, it's just going through a midlife crisis. I mean, the series is damn near 40 years old and a lot has happened in that time. I really feel that if Square Enix can learn from their mistakes all while incorporating some of the best aspects of 15 and 16 into a whole new world, then 17 will be good enough to take 7's place. But who knows, man, the next game might be complete booty cheeks. The Final Fantasy franchise has built up enough goodwill that it can still keep going even after dropping what some people consider two back-to-back mediocre mainline games. I mean shit, Final Fantasy XIV has been going strong for years and the next expansion is dropping this summer, and after the 7 remakes are done, they're gonna have to remake something else. So regardless of how you feel about the recent Final Fantasy games, I don't think this franchise is going anywhere anytime soon, which means they have more chances to make a fantastic new mainline Final Fantasy game. So when that game is released, I'll just be here waiting to say I told you so. And that's the end of the video. I don't have much to say, channel's been doing great lately, I'm taking a bit of risk with this video but hopefully it performs well. And you know what, even if it doesn't, I don't think anyone should ever blame themselves for taking a risk. But yeah, as always this has been your boy Jugo Young, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace!